The last couple of weeks we've had the collapse of, I think, 3 US banks. And then, of course, in Switzerland, it was almost, I guess you'd call it a forced merger between Credit Suisse and UBS by the government. And of course, now everyone's wondering if who's next on the radar. So I guess give us a bit of your insight as to, I guess, the past couple of weeks, particularly, but I think one of the burning questions that people have is, are we going into another GFC, another 2008?
Yeah, I think to answer that, Alex, I'm probably wanting to step back and just, we've had low and declining interest rates since the GFC, effectively. I mean, long-term interest rates in the GFC were 5-6%. They got down to nothing or negative in around COVID and post-COVID, and obviously they've moved up a lot. So I think when you have a situation where you have extremes like that, people begin to act as if things are never going to change. So, you would well have known and read plenty of stuff around probably only 18 months ago that interest rates were never going to go up again, pretty much. We were going to live in this low rate environment forever. And so lots of investment strategies have been built around that. And you just don't know what's out there. So that's a long-winded way of saying, look, are we going to have another banking crisis? I don't think so. The crises we've seen so far have had unique elements to it. The SVB, Silicon Valley Bank implosion was because they had too many assets, not so they had all these deposits which they'd invested in so-called safe government bonds, which turned out, not to be safe. So it wasn't that they had a whole lot of bad lending. It's a different crisis. Credit Suisse is probably a little bit more along the lines, I suspect, of what I was saying about low interest rates and different strategies, which have not, which have come home to roost. So my concern is that as I look forward, that there's a lot of not unexplored areas, but areas where things are going to come to light over the coming years. What kind of things are those? Well, there's lots of things hanging around at the moment, like, we haven't really seen adjustment to residential property prices in instance. So what's going to happen there? Commercial property prices haven't adjusted to the interest rate scenario. Stock prices generally have not, I don't think, fully reflected the new interest rate environment. So there's lots of things which we still have to see how they play through. And, could that lead through to the banks ultimately? Inevitably, they're the most leveraged pretty much, of the financial institutions. And so everything kind of where you've got leverage, you do have risk. But at this point in time, the Australian banks are very well capitalized, well regulated. And so we don't worry about them at all. But could we have a banking crisis? Sure. We just don't know what sits out. It's too early to say.
I was going to say, you never know what the black swan is going to be. I remember with 2008, no one even heard of subprime mortgages until the whole crisis started unfolding.
Yes.
So it's one of those classic things. You don't know what you don't know, I guess.
Yes. I think the banks in general are much better regulated today than they were in the GFC. Levels of capital are much higher. Australian banks have sort of more conservative regulation than others, and so on. So there's lots of positives you can look to from things people have learned from the GFC. But I have no doubt whatsoever that there are a whole lot of pretty dud strategies that have been built on low interest rates, which have yet to come home.
Well, the one that's always bothered me is house prices, because Australia is the second most indebted households on earth. And as rates rise, I'm assuming a significant portion of the population is going to be squeezed You know, I always quote the proverb where it says, you know, the rich rules over the poor and the borrower becomes the slave of the lender. My concern is that many Australians will be enslaved as these rate rises really start to bite. Yeah, I mean, do you think because the debt levels are so high in Australia, that will have an effect on the banks in the form of defaults? Because as you say, the crisis to date, particularly in the US, has been a liquidity one as opposed to a solvency one.
Yes.
Would you see that as a risk for the Australian banks on a longer term basis?
Yeah, well, look, if you have a look and look backwards first, the losses that Australian banks have generated on housing have been, over a long period of time, have been negligible. I think the worst it got to in the early 90s or the mid 90s was sort of 7 or 8 basis points of write-offs from
Wow, so very little.
It's very, very little. Now, you know, is it going to be different this time? Yeah, you can see some things that would make you worry. The bits you worry about really are probably the mortgages written in the last 2 years or so.
COVID, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, and it's kind of, people have taken out mortgages at 2% if they were lucky, or 2.5%, and now they're going to be faced with refinancing. So I think the banks are going to have more. Well, they're expecting it, you know. So this is, it's not like this,
they're preparing.
But there's some quite extreme views out there, as you know. I was reading a piece in the Fin this morning suggesting house prices we're going to fall 15 to 20% from here, and there'll be major issues for the you know, for a whole heap of consumers. Thus far, it hasn't played through. The other thing I think you would say is generally the more alarmist predictions have not come true. You know, you look at how much people expected house prices to fall, you know, during COVID or whatever, and prices went up. You just don't know. But are there challenges out there? For sure. And I have noted in the last few days comments from Westpac and from NAB just saying, look, they're starting to see those defaults coming through. You know, but most of the housing book is well within the money. You know, people have made a lot of money in their houses, and banks are unlikely to lose a lot of money on housing. That's certainly been the history.
Yeah.